Could one decision alter the fate of hundreds of soldiers? The world was muffled, painted in shades of gray and white. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Sergeant Frank Miller of the 109th Field Artillery Battalion, 28th Infantry Division, felt the cold seep through his wool coat, through his skin, and into his bones. It was a damp, biting cold that seemed to cling to the very air. He lay prone on a snow-dusted ridge, the frozen earth unforgiving beneath him. His M3 binoculars were pressed so hard against his eyes that he imagined the metal would leave permanent marks. Below him, winding through a narrow valley, a thin ribbon of road snaked through the dense pines. It was a vital artery, and right now it was beginning to throb with enemy life. The distant rumble he'd been hearing for the last hour was no longer a vague vibration in his chest. It had a shape now, a sound. It was the growl of engines, the clatter of steel tracks, the low murmur of a great beast awakening. Through the morning mist, the first shapes emerged. Ghostly at first, then solidifying into the hard, angular lines of German machinery. Miller's breath hitched, a small puff of white vapor instantly snatched away by the wind. He wasn't just seeing vehicles. He was seeing a target of opportunity, so perfect, so rare, it felt like a trap. A German supply convoy, and not a small one. It was a long, black snake slithering into the valley, blissfully unaware of the eyes watching from above. Miller's mind, a machine honed by years of training and the brutal reality of combat, began its cold calculus. He counted them as they appeared. Opel Blitz trucks, their canvas tops dark with moisture. SED KFC, 251 half-tracks, bristling with machine guns and packed with infantry. He even spotted a few horse-drawn wagons, a stark reminder of the German army's logistical strain. But what made his heart beat faster were the fuel tankers and the ammunition carriers. They were the convoy's volatile heart. A single, well-placed shell in the right spot could start a chain reaction that would cripple the entire column. He keyed the mic on his SCR 610 radio, his voice a low, steady whisper. Eagle-Eye to Big Gun. I have eyes on a target. Grid 479er, 321. Enemy convoy, moving west. Over. The static crackled in his ear before a calm voice replied. Big Gun copies, Eagle-Eye. Stand by for fire mission. Miller knew what stand by meant. It meant waiting for clearance. It meant officers miles away looking at maps, weighing strategic priorities, coordinating with other units. It was the proper way to do things, the safe way, the slow way. But down in the valley, the head of the snake was already approaching the narrowest point of the road, a place where a single disabled vehicle could block the path for everyone behind it. The window of opportunity was small, and it was closing fast. He watched the German soldiers, some walking alongside the trucks, their shoulders hunched against the cold. They looked relaxed, confident in the cover of the dense forest and the early morning fog. They felt safe. That was their mistake. Miller felt the familiar tension coil in his gut. It was the hunter's stillness, the predator's focus. He was connected to a 105mm M2A1 howitzer crew hidden 2 miles behind him, a weapon he knew as well as his own hands. They were waiting for his numbers, for his word. Standard procedure demanded a ranging shot, then a slow, methodical barrage to box them in. But standard procedure would give them time to react, to scatter, to find cover. And Frank Miller wasn't thinking about standard procedure. He was thinking about the sheer destructive potential laid out before him. An entire enemy column, ripe for the taking. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The fate of hundreds of men, his own men, who would soon face the soldiers and supplies in that convoy, rested on what he did in the next few minutes. Who would risk breaking protocol for the chance to save lives? Sergeant Frank Miller was not a reckless man. He was a product of the Great Depression, a farm boy from Ohio who understood the value of patience, hard work, and following the rules. When he enlisted in 1941, the Army saw in him a quiet competence and an almost unnatural gift for mathematics. They didn't make him a rifleman. They sent him to artillery school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. There, under the relentless sun, he learned the intricate dance of ballistics. He learned about windage and elevation, powder charges, and fuse timings. He memorized firing tables until the numbers were burned into his memory. To his instructors, he was the model student, precise, methodical, and respectful of the chain of command. But war has a way of changing a man. His first taste of combat was in North Africa, during the chaotic days of the Kasserine Pass. He saw what happened when things went wrong, when command was slow and the enemy was fast. He saw good men die because of indecision. It was there he learned that the manuals, as valuable as they were, couldn't account for the sheer bloody mess of a real firefight. The rules were a guide, not a gospel. After Africa came Sicily, and then the brutal slog through Italy. He was no longer a green recruit calculating hypothetical trajectories. He was a seasoned gunner who could smell a change in the weather and know how it would affect his shell's flight path. He earned the nickname Deadeye, not for his marksmanship with a rifle, but for his uncanny ability to land a first-round hit with a 3-ton howitzer from miles away. His crew trusted him implicitly. They had seen him perform miracles. During the breakout from Normandy, pinned down by a German 80mm gun that had already destroyed 2 of their company's tanks, Miller had done the impossible. Without a spotter, using only a map and the sound of the enemy gun, he had calculated the coordinates and fired a single shell. The enemy gun went silent. The infantry commander later said it was the single most important shot of their advance, but he had also developed a reputation among some officers as a man who bent the rules. He wasn't insubordinate, not openly. He just had a habit of interpreting orders to achieve maximum effect. If the order was to fire a standard 3-round barrage, but Miller knew that 2 perfectly timed shots would do the job faster and save ammunition, he would fire 2 shots. If protocol demanded a 10-minute wait for confirmation on a target that was about to disappear, he might experience radio trouble for a minute or 2 while his crew got the gun ready. He wasn't seeking glory. He saw war as a series of math problems, and he was determined to solve them in the most efficient way possible. The most efficient solution was the one that destroyed the most enemy material and saved the most American lives. Protocol, in his mind, was a tool, not a master. And now, lying on this frozen ridge in the Ardennes, he was facing the biggest math problem of his life. The sheer size of the enemy convoy represented an immense threat. These were supplies and reinforcements intended for the German spearhead that was trying to break their lines. Every truck, every soldier, every bullet that reached the front would cost American lives. His superiors would want to handle this by the book. They would see the convoy on a map, a static icon to be dealt with methodically. But Frank Miller saw it for what it was, a living, moving threat, a serpent whose head had to be cut off now. And he knew a way to do it, a dangerous way, a way that was strictly, explicitly forbidden. Could a single artillery piece overcome such organized strength? The German column, Miller observed, was a testament to the Wehrmacht's desperate but still formidable power. This was no ragtag group of stragglers. It was a well-organized logistical push, the lifeblood of the offensive. Miller's trained eye broke it down, not into vehicles, but into components of a military machine. Leading the convoy were 2 SDKFZ, 251 half-tracks. These were the shepherds of the flock, their armor just enough to repel small arms fire, their forward-mounted MG-42 machine guns capable of spitting out over 1,000 rounds a minute. They were there to scout ahead and suppress any initial resistance. Behind them came the core of the column, a long line of Opel Blitz trucks. These 3-ton workhorses were the backbone of German logistics. Miller counted over 30 of them, their canvas covers stretched taut over unseen cargo. He knew what they carried: crates of 7.92mm ammunition for rifles and machine guns, stacks of Panzerfausts, the simple but deadly anti-tank weapons that were the bane of American armor, mortar rounds, grenades, medical supplies, and food. Each truck was a mobile cache of war material. Interspersed between the cargo trucks were the high-value targets. He identified at least 4 tankers, their cylindrical shapes unmistakable even at this distance. These trucks carried the gasoline that fed the thirsty engines of the Panzers at the front. Without fuel, a tank is just a steel coffin. Then there were the ammunition carriers, larger trucks specifically designed to transport artillery shells. These were essentially rolling bombs. A direct hit on one of them wouldn't just destroy the truck. It would create a massive secondary explosion that could gut everything around it. The Germans knew the value of their cargo, and they had taken precautions. Riding in the back of several Opel Blitz trucks and in the open-topped half-tracks were squads of infantry. These were not elite stormtroopers, but they were armed and dangerous, equipped with Carabiner 98K rifles and MP-40 submachine guns. They were the convoy's immediate defense against partisans or a sudden ambush. Miller noted their posture. They were cold and weary, but alert. He could see the faint glow of cigarettes in the dim morning light. Even more concerning were the dedicated anti-aircraft assets. He spotted 2 SDKFZ 7-1 half-tracks, each mounting a quad-barreled 20mm Flak 38 cannon. These weapons were designed to shred Allied fighter bombers, but their high rate of fire made them devastating against ground troops as well. If they spotted the muzzle flash from his howitzer, they could quickly bring a hail of explosive shells down on his position. The entire convoy moved with a disciplined, practiced rhythm. The spacing between vehicles was consistent, just far enough apart to minimize damage from a single artillery strike, but close enough to maintain cohesion. They were a professional outfit on a critical mission. To an officer looking at a map, this would be a difficult target. It was long, mobile, and defended. The standard approach would be to call in a larger artillery barrage from multiple batteries, a time-on-target mission where shells from a dozen guns would land simultaneously. This would take time to coordinate, time the convoy didn't have. Miller saw something else. He saw a chain of dominoes. He saw the tight confines of the valley road, the steep wooded hills on either side offering no escape. He saw the fuel tankers and ammunition carriers placed strategically throughout the column. He didn't see a formidable, defended convoy. He saw a powder keg waiting for a spark. The question wasn't if his single howitzer could destroy it. The question was how. Could precision and courage outweigh numbers and firepower? Frank Miller lowered his binoculars, the cold metal leaving red imprints on his face. The world rushed back in, the whisper of the wind through the pines, the crunch of snow under his elbow as he shifted his weight. The numbers were already spinning in his head, a complex equation of variables and risks. First, the terrain. The valley was a gunner's dream and a driver's nightmare. The road was cut into the side of a steep hill with a sharp drop-off on the other side leading down to a frozen creek. There was no room for maneuver. A disabled vehicle in the lead would act as a cork in a bottle, trapping the entire column behind it. The trees, thick with fir and pine, would amplify the effect of his shells, creating a deadly rain of splintered wood and shrapnel. Distance was next. He'd already triangulated his position with known landmarks on his map. The head of the convoy was approximately 4,500 meters away. A comfortable range for the 105mm howitzer. Close enough for accuracy, far enough to make it difficult for the enemy to pinpoint his gun's location immediately. But distance was a changing variable. The convoy was moving at a steady crawl, maybe 10 kilometers per hour. He had to lead the target to predict where the head of the column would be when his shell, after its long, arcing journey, finally came down. Then there was the wind. It was light but gusting, coming down from the north. An unpredictable crosswind was an artilleryman's enemy. It could push a shell dozens of meters off course. He pulled a small piece of cloth from his pocket and let it dangle. He watched its movement, mentally calculating the correction needed. A little bit of left rudder, as the pilots would say. He factored in the temperature, the air density, even the slight rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, a tiny factor that could mean the difference between a hit and a miss at this range. He keyed his mic again, his voice still a low whisper. Eagle eye to big gun, fire mission, target, lead vehicle, enemy convoy, high explosive, fuse quick, on my command. He was laying the groundwork, getting his crew ready. He gave them the initial coordinates, the raw data they needed to lay the gun. But he held back the order to fire. The biggest risk factor wasn't the enemy or the weather. It was time. The standard procedure for a fire mission like this was deliberate. First, a ranging shot. This shell would be intentionally aimed slightly off target, often with a smoke marker, to allow the spotter to see the impact and give corrections. Add 50, right 100, he would say, and the gun crew would adjust. Then a second ranging shot to confirm. Only then, once the gun was perfectly dialed in, would the command, fire for effect, be given, unleashing the full battery. But this process could take minutes. Minutes the convoy would use to drive right through the kill zone. Minutes the enemy would use to hear the first shell, realize they were being targeted, and scatter. No, a ranging shot was a luxury he couldn't afford. He needed the first shell to be a devastating surgical strike, a knockout blow. This meant he had to be perfect. His calculations had to be flawless. And that wasn't the only risk. His plan required not just a perfect first shot, but a rapid succession of shots immediately after. He needed to hit the lead vehicle to block the road, then immediately walk his fire back down the column, targeting the fuel and ammunition trucks before the Germans could even understand what was happening. This would require a rate of fire far beyond what the manuals recommended. It would put an immense strain on his gun and his crew. It was a gamble, a massive, high-stakes bet. He was staking his reputation, his career, and the lives of his crew on his ability to solve this one complex problem in a single, violent burst of calculation and action. He took a deep breath, the icy air burning his lungs. The courage wasn't about facing enemy fire. It was about taking this responsibility on himself. He was about to break the rules, and if he was wrong, the failure would be his alone. Would you defy orders if success meant changing the course of battle? Deep in Frank Miller's memory, filed away with countless firing tables and technical specifications, was a lecture from an old, grizzled instructor back at Fort Sill. The instructor's name was Master Sergeant Crow, a veteran of the First World War who had forgotten more about artillery than most men would ever learn. Crow had a healthy disrespect for ivory tower officers and a deep love for the guns themselves. One hot afternoon, after the official lessons were done, Crow gathered a few of his best students, Miller among them. "The book," Crow had said, tapping a thick field manual, "tells you how to fight a war on paper. It tells you to fire no more than 3 rounds a minute for the first 30 minutes, then 1 round a minute after that. It tells you to swab the bore between every few rounds. It tells you to let the gun cool. The book is written to keep you and this expensive piece of steel safe." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But let me tell you something the book won't. Sometimes the war ain't on paper. Sometimes you got a target that won't be there in 5 minutes. Sometimes the difference between winning and losing is what you can do in 30 seconds. And then he described it, a technique he called a mad minute or a burning barrage. It was a desperate all-or-nothing tactic. It involved firing the howitzer at its maximum possible rate, ignoring all the safety protocols. The loader and gunner would work in a frantic, synchronized rhythm, slamming shells into the breech and firing as fast as the mechanism would allow. Don't swab the bore. Don't wait for the barrel to cool. Just keep firing. The consequences were severe. Firing a cannon that fast generated immense heat. The barrel would begin to glow a dull red. The rifling inside would wear down at an incredible rate, ruining the gun's accuracy. The intense heat could even cause a shell to cook off, detonate prematurely inside the breech, vaporizing the gun and its crew in a ball of fire. It was for this reason the technique was strictly forbidden by U.S. Army regulations. Any gunner caught doing it would face a court-martial. "You only do this," Master Sergeant Crow had warned, his voice grim, "when the alternative is worse. You do it when your brothers in the infantry are about to be overrun. You do it when you have a chance to break the enemy's back and end the fight right then and there. You sacrifice the gun to save the men, and you pray it doesn't blow up in your face." That memory, buried for years, now surfaced with crystal clarity. This was that moment. This was the alternative. Letting that convoy reach the front was the worse option. It would translate directly into American casualties. The burning barrage was the only way to sow enough chaos and destruction fast enough to completely annihilate the column before it could disperse. It was a forbidden trick, a pact with machinery and high explosives, trading the long-term life of his gun for a short, violent burst of unmatched firepower. The decision solidified in his mind. It was no longer a question of if, but how. He couldn't tell his crew what he was about to do. They were good soldiers. They would follow his firing commands. But if he ordered them to break regulations so blatantly, one of them might hesitate or even refuse. The responsibility had to be his alone. He would simply give them the firing commands, one after another, faster than they had ever received them before. They would be too busy serving the gun to question the pace. He would bear the full weight of the consequences, whether it was a court-martial from his own side or a catastrophic explosion from the gun itself. He looked down at the convoy one last time. The lead half-track was approaching the pre-calculated kill zone. It was time. He was about to trade a piece of Army property for a victory. A dangerous, unauthorized, and utterly necessary transaction. Could nerves withstand the responsibility of life and death decisions? 2 miles behind the ridge, hidden under a canopy of snow-laden pine trees and camouflage netting, the crew of the M2A1 howitzer stood ready. The 5 men moved with an economy of motion born of endless drills and the shared experience of combat. They were a well-oiled machine, and Sergeant Frank Miller was their operator. When Miller's voice crackled over the radio with the initial fire mission, the tension in the gun pit became a palpable thing. The casual banter ceased. Every man knew his role. Private First Class Antonio "Tony" Gallo, the loader, was the muscle. He was a short, powerful kid from Brooklyn who could hoist the 33-pound high-explosive shells as if they were sacks of potatoes. He already had the first round cradled in his arms, waiting. The shell was a thing of deadly beauty, olive-drab steel with a bright yellow band indicating its high-explosive filling. On its nose was the M51A5 point-detonating fuse, set to quick, meaning it would explode on impact. Corporal Sam Jones, the gunner, was already peering through the panoramic telescope, his hands on the traversing and elevating wheels. He was the one who would physically lay the gun, translating Miller's cold numbers into a precise angle of steel. He spun the wheels with practiced ease, lining up the crosshairs on the aiming stakes they had planted earlier. The breech was open, a dark, hungry mouth waiting to be fed. The air smelled of cold steel, damp earth, and gun oil. The tension was not one of fear, but of intense focus. It was the calm concentration of craftsmen about to perform a difficult and dangerous task. Miller's voice came over the radio again, this time with the final firing data. Deflection 2849er, elevation 397. Jones repeated the numbers as he made the final minute adjustments. Deflection 2849er, elevation 397. Gun laid. Load, came Miller's next command. It was a single word, sharp and clear. Tony Gallo stepped forward, shoved the shell into the breech with a grunt, the projectile seating with a solid metallic thunk. Behind him, another crewman placed the correct powder charge, a bundle of silk bags filled with propellant. The number of bags determined the shell's velocity and range. Miller's calculation had been precise. The breech operator, a lanky private named O'Malley, slammed the heavy breech block shut, the mechanism locking with a loud, satisfying clack. He yelled the final confirmation, his voice cutting through the quiet woods. "Ready?" The whole process had taken less than 15 seconds. Now there was only silence. Every man in the pit was frozen, waiting. They were all connected to Miller by a thin copper wire and the invisible waves of the radio. They stared at the gun, a dormant beast, knowing that in a moment it would unleash a controlled, thunderous violence. This was the moment of truth, the precipice between silence and chaos. Sam Jones had his hand on the firing lanyard. Tony Gallo was already reaching for the second shell. They were professionals, ready to do their job. They had no idea that their sergeant was about to push them, and their gun far beyond the limits of their training. They trusted his calculations. They trusted his judgment. The rising tension was the feeling of a drawn bowstring, pulled taut and ready to be released. In their minds, they were preparing for a standard fire mission. A few rounds, a few adjustments, a job well done. They couldn't feel the weight of the forbidden decision that Miller had made alone on that cold, lonely ridge. Could genius go unrecognized until it strikes? Miles behind the front lines, in a drafty farmhouse commandeered as a battalion command post, Lieutenant Colonel Davies leaned over a massive map spread across a makeshift table. The map was a mosaic of grease pencil markings showing known enemy positions in red and friendly units in blue. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale coffee, wet wool, and the nervous energy of men trying to make sense of a rapidly deteriorating situation. The German offensive had caught them by surprise, and the 28th Infantry Division was taking the brunt of the initial assault. Every report that crackled through the radios spoke of overwhelming numbers, of German armor pushing through positions that were thought to be secure. Davies's job was to use his artillery, the big guns like Miller's, to blunt the enemy's advance, to break up their attacks, and to buy precious time for the line to stabilize. He was a good officer, a man who believed in structure, discipline, and the overwhelming power of coordinated American firepower. A runner brought him a fresh report. A spotter from Able Battery, Sergeant Miller, had identified a significant enemy convoy. Davies found the grid square on the map. He saw the road, the valley. He immediately understood the tactical importance. Cutting that supply line could starve a portion of the German spearhead. "Good work, Sergeant," he murmured to himself. He turned to his fire direction officer, a young captain. "Get me division artillery on the horn. I want a full battalion time-on-target strike on those coordinates. All 12 guns. Let's obliterate them." The captain nodded and moved to the radio set. This was the standard textbook response. A target this valuable warranted a massive, coordinated strike. It was powerful, decisive, and controlled. It would take 10, maybe 15 minutes to coordinate with the other batteries, to get all the guns laid, and to synchronize the firing. To Davies, this was an acceptable delay for a guaranteed result. He had no way of knowing what Sergeant Miller was seeing in real time. He couldn't see the lead vehicle about to enter the perfect ambush point. He couldn't feel the closing window of opportunity. On his map, the convoy was a stationary red line. To Miller, it was a moving, fleeting chance. Davies's command post was a world of strategy and abstract symbols. Miller's world was one of immediate, sensory reality. The cold, the wind, the rumble of engines. The commanders saw the big picture, but the soldiers at the front saw the sharp, deadly details. Unaware of Miller's internal debate, the command staff proceeded by the book. They began the slow, deliberate process of calling up a major artillery strike. They were operating on the assumption that their man in the field, a reliable and highly skilled NCO, was doing his job as trained: observe, report, and wait for orders. They had no reason to believe that Sergeant Miller was listening to their radio traffic, hearing the requests for a battalion-level strike, and knowing with absolute certainty that it would be too late. He was a tiny cog in a giant machine, and the machine was beginning to turn. But Frank Miller had decided to take the machine's controls into his own hands, if only for a few critical moments. The genius of his plan, or the recklessness of it, was entirely his own, unfolding in a place beyond the sight and knowledge of his superiors. He was about to start a fire, and they wouldn't even know his name was on the match. Could one perfect strike create a cascade of destruction? The world held its breath. On the ridge, Frank Miller watched the lead German half-track crawl into the exact spot he had marked in his mind. It was a slight bend in the road, with a steep rock face on one side and a sheer drop on the other. It was the perfect choke point. His thumb hovered over the transmit button. The calculations were done. The risk was accepted. The moment was now. "Fire," he said. His voice was unnaturally calm, a single sharp command that cut through the radio static. 2 miles away in the gun pit, Sam Jones yanked the lanyard. The howitzer roared. The sound was not a bang, but a deep, gut-punching whump that ripped through the quiet forest. The massive steel barrel recoiled violently, a flash of orange flame erupted from the muzzle, and a 33-pound shell of high-explosive steel was sent screaming into the sky. The shell traveled in a high, invisible arc, climbing thousands of feet before gravity took hold and pulled it back toward the earth. For 20 long seconds, there was only the echo of the gun and the ringing in the crew's ears. Miller held his binoculars steady, his entire being focused on that one small section of road. He didn't breathe. And then it happened. The earth erupted. A geyser of black soil, shattered rock, and orange flame shot skyward, right in the path of the lead half-track. Miller hadn't aimed for the vehicle itself. He had aimed for the road just in front of it. The M51A5 quick fuse detonated the shell on the slightest impact. The resulting explosion didn't just create a crater. It shattered the frozen road surface and, more importantly, triggered a small landslide from the steep hillside. The German driver, startled by the sudden explosion, instinctively slammed on the brakes. It was the worst possible thing he could have done. The half-track steel track slid on the icy, broken ground. With a sickening lurch, the vehicle veered sideways, its front end dipping over the edge of the road. For a heart-stopping moment, it teetered there, its crew scrambling to get out. Then, with a groan of tortured metal, it tumbled over the edge, crashing down the steep embankment and landing upside down in the frozen creek below. Chaos erupted in the convoy. The vehicle directly behind the half-track, an Opel Blitz truck, slammed on its brakes, its tires squealing. The truck behind it couldn't stop in time, and there was a loud crunch of metal on metal. In seconds, the head of the column was a tangled mess. The perfect strike hadn't just destroyed a vehicle, it had blocked the road, created panic, and sealed the trap. The long black snake was now headless and trapped in a cage of its own making. German soldiers were leaping from their trucks, shouting, confused. They didn't know where the shot had come from. They were looking up at the sky, expecting fighter bombers. They were vulnerable, exposed. Miller felt a cold surge of triumph, but there was no time to savor it. This was just the beginning. Before the echo of the first explosion had even faded, he was keying his mic again, his voice urgent and sharp, rattling off the new coordinates. He was walking the fire down the line. Next target, grid 479er, 319er, fire! He was starting the burning barrage. Could disciplined forces unravel from an unexpected strike? For the soldiers in the German convoy, the world had transformed from mundane cold to sheer terror in the space of a heartbeat. One moment, they were thinking about warm food, and the next, cigarette. The next, the ground in front of them had violently opened up. Their lead vehicle had vanished over a cliff, and the terrifying, unmistakable whistle of incoming artillery filled the air. Panic is a virus, and it spread through the column with lightning speed. The initial reaction was pure animal instinct. Soldiers bailed out of the trucks, seeking cover that wasn't there. They scrambled for the ditches or tried to press themselves flat against the frozen earth. But the valley offered no real protection. The steep, rocky walls on one side and the sharp drop on the other turned the road into a killing jar. The drivers, caught between the instinct to flee and their orders to stay with their vehicles, made fatal mistakes. Some tried to turn their large trucks around on the narrow road, succeeding only in jackknifing their vehicles and blocking the path even more completely. Others simply abandoned their trucks, leaving the engines running, doors hanging open. The disciplined cohesion that had defined the convoy just minutes earlier evaporated into a frenzy of individual survival. Officers shouted orders, but their voices were lost in the growing chaos and the sound of crashing metal. The second shell landed before they had time to even process the first. Miller's target was a large Opel Blitz truck he had identified as a probable ammunition carrier. He was right. The shell impacted squarely on the truck's canvas cover. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the truck seemed to swell from within before detonating in a catastrophic explosion. A blinding white-orange fireball climbed into the gray sky, and the sound wave that followed was a physical blow, a concussive force that shattered the windows of nearby trucks and knocked men off their feet. The air was filled with shrapnel and the burning debris of the truck. A secondary explosion followed as the ammunition inside cooked off, sending a shower of deadly metal fragments scything through the air for hundreds of yards in every direction. This second, more powerful blast was the tipping point. It was no longer an attack. It was a massacre. The illusion of safety was shattered. The soldiers now understood they were trapped and being systematically destroyed. The sight of the massive fireball sent a wave of primal fear through the column. This wasn't a random barrage. It was targeted, precise, and utterly ruthless. Their anti-aircraft gunners frantically scanned the skies, but there were no planes. They tried to locate the source of the artillery, but the forested hills hid the muzzle flash, and the valley's echoes distorted the sound, making it seem like it was coming from everywhere at once. The convoy disintegrated. It ceased to be a military unit and became a collection of terrified men running for their lives. They abandoned their weapons, their equipment, and their mission. The German machine, so feared for its efficiency and discipline, had been broken by two perfectly placed shells and the sheer, unexpected violence of the attack. They were no longer soldiers. They were just targets. Could teamwork under stress determine the outcome? Back in the gun pit, the world had shrunk to the space around the howitzer. There was no convoy, no valley, no strategy. There was only the gun, the shells, and the voice of Sergeant Miller in the radio headset. When Miller's second fire command came less than 30 seconds after the first, it was like a jolt of electricity through the crew. This was not normal. This was not the deliberate, measured pace of a standard fire mission. This was something else entirely. Next target, grid 479er, 319er, fire! Tony Gallo, the loader, didn't have time to think. He just reacted. He had the second shell ready, and he slammed it into the open breach almost before the recoil from the first shot had settled. Sam Jones, the gunner, was a blur of motion, his hands flying across the traversing and elevating wheels, his eyes locked on the dials. He spun the wheels, chasing the new numbers Miller was barking out. There was no time for confirmation, no time for double-checking. It was all instinct and muscle memory. "Gun laid!" he shouted, his voice strained. O'Malley slammed the breech shut. "Ready?" Jones pulled the lanyard. Whump! The gun roared again, bucking like a mule. The smell of burnt cordite was thick in the air now, a sharp, acrid scent that stung the nostrils. Before the sound had faded, Miller's voice was back, relentless, urgent. "Next target, grid 479er, 317. It's a fuel tanker. Fire!" The crew exchanged a fleeting glance. A fuel tanker. The pace? They were beginning to understand. This was a mad minute. This was Sergeant Miller's forbidden trick. There was a flicker of hesitation in Tony Gallo's eyes, the ghost of Master Sergeant Crow's warnings about cook-offs and catastrophic failure. The barrel of the howitzer was already radiating a visible heat shimmer. But then he looked at his crewmates, at the grim determination on their faces. They trusted Miller. Their job was not to question, but to perform. Any doubt was buried under a wave of adrenaline and duty. He grabbed the third shell. It felt warm to the touch. The teamwork became a frantic, desperate ballet. Each man anticipated the next move. The shell was loaded, the gun was laid, the breech was locked, the lanyard was pulled. Over and over, the rhythm was punishing. Whump, load, aim, lock, whump, load, aim, lock. The noise was deafening. The ground shook with each shot. Smoke filled the gun pit, making their eyes water. Their muscles screamed with effort. They were pushing the weapon and themselves to the absolute breaking point. This was precision under the ultimate pressure. It wasn't just one man's skill. It was the synchronized effort of a team pushed beyond its limits, held together by the calm, commanding voice of their sergeant on the radio. They were the instruments, and Frank Miller was the conductor of this symphony of destruction. And as long as his voice kept coming, they would continue to play. Could one act ripple beyond intention? The third shell, aimed at the fuel tanker, found its mark. The result was not just an explosion, but an inferno. The high-explosive round tore through the thin steel skin of the tanker, and the volatile gasoline within ignited instantly. A roiling fireball of incandescent orange and black smoke billowed hundreds of feet into the air, a funeral pyre for the convoy. The burning fuel did not stay contained. It flowed like lava across the road, engulfing a nearby Opel Blitz truck and the screaming men who had been trying to take cover behind it. The fire spread to the dry pines lining the road, and soon the trees themselves were torches, their needles crackling and popping in the intense heat. The valley floor was becoming a vision of hell. The initial calculated destruction was now spawning its own chaos. A fourth shell struck a horse-drawn supply wagon. The wooden cart disintegrated, and the terrified animals, broken free from their harnesses, bolted in random directions, adding to the confusion and panic on the road. The ripple effect was both physical and psychological. The massive fireball from the fuel tanker served as a terrifying beacon. For miles around, other units, both American and German, saw the column of black smoke rising above the Ardennes forest. For the Americans, it was a sign of hope, a signal that someone, somewhere, was hitting the enemy hard. For the Germans, it was a source of dread, a clear indication that one of their vital supply lines had been savagely severed. The chaos on the ground multiplied. Another truck, trying to reverse away from the flames, slid off the icy road and overturned, spilling its cargo of mortar rounds across the ground. While they didn't explode, they created yet another obstacle, further cementing the blockage. The fires began to cook off ammunition in the abandoned trucks. The sporadic pop-pop-pop of rifle cartridges and the occasional deeper thump of an exploding grenade added to the terrifying symphony of destruction. These were not impacts from Miller's gun. They were the convoy consuming itself. Miller, watching from his perch, had intended to create a choke point and destroy key targets. He had not intended to set the entire valley on fire. He had not accounted for the cascading failures, the secondary explosions, the sheer uncontrollable momentum of the destruction he had unleashed. His precise mathematical attack had taken on a life of its own, becoming a wild, untamable force. He was no longer just a gunner executing a fire mission. He was the architect of a catastrophe, a man who had kicked a single stone and started an avalanche. The consequences were spreading far beyond his initial calculations, and the battle for the valley was now being fought not just by his gun, but by the fire and fear he had unleashed. Could you stay calm when every second counts? For Frank Miller, the world outside the circular view of his binoculars had ceased to exist. The biting cold, the gnawing hunger, the fatigue in his bones, all of it was gone, burned away by the incandescent focus of the moment. But beneath that cold, professional exterior, a storm was raging. With each shell he called, the pressure mounted. The first shot had been a gamble. The second was a confirmation. By the third and fourth, he was deep into forbidden territory. He could feel the heat from the gun barrel 2 miles away and phantom warmth in his mind. He knew the risk he was putting his crew in. He could picture them in the gun pit, their faces slick with sweat despite the freezing air, their movements a frantic blur. If the gun failed, if a shell cooked off in the breach, it would be his fault. Their lives were in his hands, balanced on the tip of his commands. The weight of that responsibility was immense, a physical pressure on his chest. Then there was the moral calculus. Through his lenses, he was not just seeing targets, he was seeing human beings. He saw them running, falling, burning. He saw the chaos and terror he was creating. He was a farm boy from Ohio, taught to value life. Now his job was to end it as efficiently as possible. To win, to protect his own, he had to become an instrument of death on a scale he had never imagined. He pushed the thought away. There was no room for it. Empathy was a liability he could not afford. Hesitation would cost American lives. He had to remain detached, a surgeon with a scalpel of high explosives. But the strain was beginning to show. A slight tremor started in his hands. He gripped the binoculars tighter, forcing them still. His breathing became shallow, and he had to consciously force himself to take a deep, steadying breath. "Stay calm, Frank," he whispered to himself, his own voice a foreign sound in the quiet of the ridge. "Just do the math." He focused on the variables, the new target, another ammunition truck, the distance, slightly shorter now as he walked his fire down the column, the wind still gusting. He compartmentalized the fear, the guilt, the pressure. He locked them in a mental box and focused on the numbers. The numbers were clean. They were pure. They didn't scream or burn. The success of the mission, the survival of his crew, and his own sanity depended on his ability to cling to that cold, hard logic. Every second that passed, the enemy could be reorganizing, fighting back. The anti-aircraft gunners could be finding his position. There was no time for doubt. He keyed the mic, his voice betraying none of the turmoil inside him. It was steady, professional, deadly. Next target, fire! He was a man walking a tightrope over a canyon of fire, and the only way to keep his balance was to never, ever look down. Could you act decisively with no guidance? Just as Miller was about to call in the coordinates for his fifth shot, a new sound filled his headset, a loud, grating burst of static, followed by silence. He tapped his earpiece. Nothing. He checked the connections on his SCR 610 radio, his heart sinking. The line was dead. He didn't know the cause. It could be a simple equipment malfunction. It could be enemy jamming. Or, worst of all, a German counter-battery shell could have landed near his gun position, severing the line, or, God forbid, hitting the crew. The thought sent a jolt of ice through his veins. For a terrifying moment, he was completely alone. His lifeline to his weapon was cut. The burning barrage had stopped mid-crescendo. Down in the valley, the chaos continued, but the relentless, methodical pressure from his howitzer had ceased. This was the most dangerous moment. A lull in the attack would give the surviving Germans a chance to breathe, to rally, to fight back. The two quad 20mm flak guns were still intact, their crews desperately trying to get their weapons into a position to fire into the hills. If they started spraying the ridges, his own exposed position could become untenable. He was blind, deaf, and alone. Protocol had a clear answer for this situation: fall back to a secure location and re-establish communication. His primary duty as a forward observer was to observe and report. Without a radio, he was just a man with a pair of binoculars. But Frank Miller was not a man who followed protocol when lives were at stake. He had started this. He had to finish it. His mind raced, searching for a solution. He had no way to talk to his gun crew, but they knew the last target he had given them. They were disciplined. They would be waiting for his next command. How could he guide them without a voice? He remembered another of Master Sergeant Crow's unconventional lessons. "If you lose comms," the old man had said, "you ain't useless. You got a rifle, don't you?" Miller looked down at the M1 Garand lying beside him in the snow. It was a standard-issue rifle, reliable and accurate. But how could a rifle guide a howitzer? Crow's lesson came back to him. Tracer rounds. The M1 could fire M25 tracer rounds, which left a bright red streak in the air, visible for hundreds of yards. It was a crude method, designed for marking targets for aircraft or machine gunners, not for the precise work of artillery. But it was all he had. It was a desperate, almost insane idea. He would have to fire a tracer round at the next target he wanted his crew to hit. He would be revealing his exact position to the enemy below. But he was betting that his own gun crew, looking in the general direction of the target zone, would see the brief, bright streak of red light. He was betting they would be smart enough and audacious enough to understand his intention. Shoot where this bullet goes. It was a communication of pure violence, a signal flare of death. Acting alone with no guidance and no approval, he loaded a clip containing a single tracer round into his Garand. He shouldered the rifle, the cold stock pressing against his cheek. He was no longer just an observer. He was about to become a direct participant in the firefight, linking his own survival directly to the hope that his men would understand his silent command. Could one strike unravel months of preparation? In a command half-track tucked away at the rear of the convoy, Hauptmann Klaus Richter was trying to make sense of the apocalypse that had descended upon his unit. Richter was a career officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front. He was a methodical, disciplined man who believed in order and control. For the past 2 months, he had meticulously planned this supply column. He had fought for every truck, every liter of fuel, every crate of ammunition. This convoy was his responsibility, and its successful arrival at the front was critical for the 6th Panzer Army's advance. Now his careful planning was being turned into a smoldering ruin. The first reports that reached him were panicked and contradictory. "We're under air attack," one soldier screamed over the radio before the line went dead. "It's partisans with mortars," yelled another. Richter, peering through his periscope, knew it was neither. The explosions were too powerful, too rhythmic for mortars. And there were no aircraft in the sky. This was artillery, precise, deadly, and terrifyingly effective. His training kicked in. His first order was for the vehicles to disperse. A foolish command, he realized instantly. There was nowhere to go. The narrow road was already a bottleneck of wrecked and burning trucks. He rescinded the order. "All units, dismount and seek cover. Flak guns, suppress the enemy position." But where was the enemy position? The shells seemed to be coming from the heavens themselves, landing with pinpoint accuracy up and down the length of his column. His command structure was disintegrating. Radio operators were reporting that they couldn't reach the forward elements. Squad leaders were unaccounted for. The morale of his men, already strained by the cold and the long march, was shattering. He saw soldiers running past his half-track, their faces masks of terror, fleeing back down the road, away from the fight. This single, unseen gun was doing more damage than a full-scale infantry assault. It was attacking his command, his control, and the very will of his soldiers to fight. He made a critical misjudgment. Believing the attack must be coming from a large pre-registered artillery battery, he ordered his remaining mobile units to pull back out of the valley. He thought he could save the tail of the convoy by retreating, but this only added to the chaos. Trucks trying to reverse crashed into those behind them. The entire column became a hopeless traffic jam, a perfect static target. Hauptmann Richter, a man who had survived the horrors of Stalingrad, was being undone by a single American gunner he could not see. The meticulous preparation, the months of planning, the strategic importance of his mission, all of it was being erased, shell by shell. His command was an illusion. The convoy was no longer his to command. It belonged to the chaos and to the unseen gunner on the hill. Could a follow-up strike seal the fate of a convoy? Frank Miller lined up the sights of his M1 Garand on the next high-value target. Another large truck he suspected was carrying ammunition, positioned right next to one of the deadly quad 20mm flak guns. The risk of his plan was enormous. By firing a tracer, he would draw a huge, flashing red arrow pointing directly to his hiding spot. The flak gun crew, if they were sharp, would see it and unleash a torrent of explosive shells that would turn his position and him into a cloud of red mist and rock dust. But the alternative, letting the enemy regroup, was worse. He took a slow breath, let it out, and squeezed the trigger. The Garand kicked hard against his shoulder. A sharp crack echoed across the ridge, and a brilliant red line streaked through the gray morning air, ending its flight with a metallic ping against the side of the target truck. For a moment, nothing happened. The German soldiers below, startled by the single rifle shot, looked around in confusion. The flak gun crew began to traverse their weapon toward his ridge. It was a race. 2 miles away in the howitzer pit, the crew had been in limbo. The radio was dead. They had no orders. They were scanning the valley, their eyes wide, watching the destruction they had caused. "What do we do, Sam?" asked Tony Gallo, his hand still holding a 33-pound shell. Before Sam Jones could answer, he saw it. A tiny, fleeting streak of red light, like a shooting star in the daytime, arcing down into the chaos of the convoy. He had seen tracers before. He knew what they were for, but he had never seen one used like this. "Did you see that?" he yelled. "It came from the ridge, from Miller's position." The realization dawned on them all at once. It wasn't a stray shot. It was a command, a silent, desperate order. "He's pointing," Gallo breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "The crazy son of a bitch is pointing for us." There was no time to question the sanity of it. It was a lifeline, a message from their sergeant. Sam Jones didn't wait for a consensus. He began spinning the wheels of the howitzer, using the memory of the tracer's path to make a rough adjustment to his aim. "It's a guess," he muttered, "but it's a good guess." "Load," he commanded. Tony Gallo rammed the shell home. The breech slammed shut. "Fire!" Jones yelled, pulling the lanyard himself. Again, the world was filled with the roar of the gun. On the ridge, Miller watched the flak cannon swinging towards him. He could see the gunner's helmet, the loader feeding a fresh clip of 20mm shells. He was exposed, out of time. He threw himself flat behind a small rock outcropping just as the enemy gun opened up. The air was torn apart by the sound of a giant canvas ripping. A stream of explosive shells slammed into the ridge where he had been moments before, shredding trees and pulverizing rock. But even as the German gun fired, a new sound was building, the high, mournful whistle of incoming death. Miller's gamble had paid off. The follow-up strike was on its way. The shells screamed down from the sky and detonated with a deafening crash, landing squarely between the ammunition truck and the flak gun. The world dissolved in a flash of light and a wave of force. The ammunition in the truck cooked off in a massive secondary explosion, and the flak gun was simply vaporized, its pieces thrown hundreds of feet in the air. The fate of the convoy was sealed. Could courage be recognized without exaggeration? The men of Charlie Company dug in on a forward slope a mile to the west of Miller's position, had a front-row seat to the unfolding destruction. They had been nervously watching the German convoy, knowing it was headed their way, filled with the men and material that would soon be trying to kill them. They had reported it, of course, but they expected the usual response, a slow, scattered artillery barrage that would harass the enemy but do little to stop them. Then the first shell hit. "Would you look at that?" muttered Sergeant Peterson, a platoon sergeant with tired eyes. "One of our boys is on target today." When the second shell hit, a ripple of cheers went through the foxholes. When the third shell ignited the fuel tanker and sent a mushroom cloud into the sky, the men were on their feet, yelling and pounding each other on the back. This was not just artillery support, this was a show. It was a systematic, brutal annihilation of a major enemy threat, carried out by what seemed to be a single, incredibly accurate gun. They couldn't know the details. They didn't know about Frank Miller, his forbidden technique, or his desperate gamble with the tracer round. All they saw was the result. They saw shell after shell landing with surgical precision, turning a formidable enemy column into a scrapyard. They watched as key targets, command vehicles, ammunition trucks, anti-aircraft guns, were eliminated one by one. For these infantrymen, who lived with the daily fear of German 88s and MG-42s, this was more than just a tactical victory. It was a massive boost to their morale. It was proof that they were not alone, that somewhere behind them, someone was watching their backs with terrifying competence. "Whoever that gunner is," a young private said to Peterson, his voice filled with awe, "I'll buy him a drink for the rest of his life." They watched the single tracer round streak across the sky, a thin red line of defiance. They didn't understand its meaning, but a moment later, when the enemy flak gun that had started to fire was blown to pieces by another perfectly timed shell, they understood the effect. This was not luck. This was artistry. It was a display of skill and courage so profound that it felt like it belonged in a movie. There was no exaggeration needed. The reality was spectacular enough. They didn't know the name Frank Miller. To them, he was just the gunner, a nameless, faceless hero behind a cannon somewhere over the horizon. But in that moment, as they watched him single-handedly dismantle an enemy force, he became a legend. He was the unseen protector, the angel of vengeance, the proof that one man, with enough skill and guts, could indeed change the course of a battle. Their fear of the coming German assault was replaced by a renewed sense of confidence. If they had gunners like that on their side, they could hold this line against anything. Could one person truly alter the course of a battle? The destruction of the flak gun was the final nail in the convoy's coffin. With their last meaningful defensive weapon gone, and the road completely blocked by a wall of fire and wreckage, the remaining German soldiers lost all cohesion. It was no longer a retreat, it was a rout. They fled into the woods, abandoning everything, their vehicles, their heavy weapons, their wounded comrades. They scrambled up the steep, snow-covered hillsides, desperate to escape the valley of death. Their only thought was survival. Miller, his radio still silent, continued his grim work. Using his M1 Garand and a steady supply of tracer rounds, he directed the howitzer's fire with a cold, ruthless efficiency. He no longer aimed for individual trucks. He began to drop shells at the rear of the convoy, boxing in the last of the vehicles and preventing any escape. Then he worked his way back toward the middle, creating a continuous line of explosions and shrapnel that swept the road from end to end. It was no longer a surgical strike. It was a final, brutal cleansing. From his vantage point, the scene below was one of complete and utter devastation. The convoy, once a symbol of German military might, was now a 2-mile-long ribbon of burning metal, thick black smoke, and death. Flames licked at the sky from a dozen different pyres. The snow in the valley was blackened with soot and stained with oil. The air, even on his ridge, was thick with the acrid smell of burning rubber, gasoline, and cordite. There was no more movement on the road. Nothing. The entire enemy force had been, for all practical purposes, erased. Miller watched for a long time, his rifle resting on the rock in front of him. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He had done it. He had taken a colossal risk, broken every rule in the book, and single-handedly destroyed a force that could have broken the American lines. He had altered the course of this small, local battle. The supplies in that convoy would never reach the German panzers. The soldiers who fled into the woods were scattered, disorganized, and no longer a coherent fighting force. He had bought time. He had saved lives. The question of whether one person could truly alter the course of a battle had been answered. He looked down at the smoldering ruin he had created. There was no sense of victory, only a hollow quiet. The math problem had been solved, but the human cost on both sides of the equation was a weight he would have to carry long after the smoke cleared. Could you measure success amid destruction? The silence that fell over the valley was more profound than the noise it replaced. The only sounds were the crackle of distant fires and the low moan of the wind. Frank Miller lay on his ridge for what felt like an hour, simply watching the smoke curl into the gray sky. His part in the battle was over. Now came the aftermath. Slowly, cautiously, American infantry patrols from Charlie Company began to move down into the valley. They advanced with their rifles ready, picking their way through the carnage. From his high perch, Miller could see them, small green figures moving through a landscape of black and gray. They looked like explorers on a dead planet. The scale of the destruction was staggering, even from a distance. The official count would come later, but a quick survey told the story. Over 50 vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, and wagons were destroyed or abandoned. The road was impassable, littered with wreckage and massive craters. The strategic impact was immediate and decisive. The German armored units that were depending on this convoy for fuel and ammunition would be stalled. This single action had created a critical bottleneck in the enemy's logistical chain, disrupting the timing of their entire offensive in this sector. The cost to the enemy in terms of manpower was equally high. Dozens were killed in the initial barrage, and hundreds more had fled into the forest, where they would be hunted down by patrols or succumb to the freezing cold. An entire German transport unit had effectively ceased to exist. For the American command, the result was an unqualified success. A major threat had been neutralized, and the front line, which had been on the verge of collapsing, was given a vital reprieve. The tactical victory was clear, measurable in terms of enemy equipment destroyed and supplies interdicted. But for Miller, the assessment was more complicated. As the initial shock wore off, he began to feel the physical toll. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now. A wave of nausea washed over him. The cold he had ignored for hours returned with a vengeance, seeping deep into his marrow. He was not a general looking at pins on a map. He was the man who had pulled the trigger. He had witnessed the direct result of every calculation. He could still see the fleeing soldiers, the exploding trucks, the burning men. Success, he realized, was a matter of perspective. For the colonels in the command post, it was a clean, decisive victory. For the grunts in the foxholes, it was a moment of salvation. For him, it was a scar, a memory of fire and smoke that would be etched into his mind forever. He had done his duty, and then some. But the sight of the smoldering valley below felt less like a triumph and more like a tombstone. Could heroism coexist with insubordination? When the radio repair team finally reached Miller's gun pit, they found a scene of controlled chaos. The 5-man crew was exhausted, their faces smudged with soot, their uniforms reeking of cordite. And the howitzer itself was a wreck. The barrel was discolored, a sickly blue-gray from the intense heat. The paint on the recoil mechanism was blistered and peeling. A fine crack was visible near the breech, a clear sign that the gun was dangerously close to catastrophic failure. It would never fire again. The crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant, took one look at the gun and whistled low. "What in God's name did you people do to this piece?" Sam Jones, the gunner, just shook his head, too tired to explain. The story came out slowly, first from the debrief of Miller's crew, then from Miller himself after a patrol brought him back from his observation post. When Lieutenant Colonel Davies heard the full report, he was caught between two conflicting emotions: fury and profound admiration. On one hand, Sergeant Miller had committed a litany of infractions. He had willfully ignored standard operating procedure. He had initiated a fire mission without proper authorization. He had deliberately and knowingly pushed a piece of valuable Army equipment past its breaking point, destroying it in the process. He had endangered his crew by ordering them to maintain a rate of fire that was explicitly forbidden for safety reasons. By the letter of the law, Miller was due for a court-martial: insubordination, destruction of government property, reckless endangerment. The charges were serious. But then there was the other hand: the results. Davies had seen the aerial reconnaissance photos of the valley. He had read the reports from the infantry commanders. Miller's unauthorized actions had single-handedly stopped a major German supply push, saved an entire infantry company from being overrun, and likely altered the course of the battle in their sector. He hadn't just bent the rules, he had shattered them, and in doing so had achieved a victory that a full battalion strike, arriving 15 minutes later, could never have matched. The debate in the command post was heated. "We have to make an example of him," argued one major. "If every sergeant decides to run his own war, we'll have chaos." "An example?" Davies retorted, his voice low and dangerous. "He just handed us the biggest tactical win we've had since this offensive started. You want to punish that?" In the end, a uniquely military compromise was reached. Sergeant Frank Miller was officially and formally reprimanded for the improper use and subsequent damage to his M2A1 howitzer. The reprimand would go into his permanent file, a black mark on an otherwise stellar record. Then, quietly and through back channels, his name was put forward for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for extreme gallantry and risk of life in actual combat with an armed enemy force. He was a hero and a rule breaker, a savior and an insubordinate. The Army, in its own peculiar wisdom, decided that he could be both at the same time. The reprimand was for the gun he sacrificed. The medal was for the men he saved. Could one act reshape military thinking? In the days and weeks that followed the destruction of the convoy, the story of Miller's Valley, as it came to be known, spread through the ranks. At first it was just a soldier's tale, whispered in hushed, awestruck tones. But soon it caught the attention of the Army's tacticians and analysts. The official after-action report was a dry, factual document, but between the lines it told a story that challenged conventional wisdom. The core of modern American military doctrine, especially for artillery, was built on the principles of mass and control. The idea was to overwhelm the enemy with coordinated, centralized firepower. Individual initiative was encouraged, but only within the strict framework of the command structure. Miller's action was the complete opposite. It was a case study in decentralized execution. It was about one man with one gun making a rapid, audacious decision based on the immediate battlefield reality, rather than waiting for the slow-moving machinery of command to catch up. Analysts at the Army War College would later study the engagement. They noted how Miller exploited a fleeting opportunity that would have been lost by the time a full battalion strike could be authorized and coordinated. They debated the concept of acceptable risk, weighing the loss of a single howitzer against the immense strategic gain. The incident highlighted a critical gap between high-level strategy and low-level tactical reality. It raised an uncomfortable question. Was the Army's rigid, top-down command structure sometimes too slow and cumbersome for the fluid, fast-paced nature of modern warfare? The forbidden trick itself, the burning barrage, was also examined. While officially condemned, some forward-thinking officers recognized it as a desperate but potentially viable tactic for break glass in case of emergency situations. Field manuals wouldn't be rewritten overnight, but the incident planted a seed. It contributed to a growing understanding that in certain situations, empowering junior leaders to make bold, independent decisions could yield disproportionately positive results. The enemy learned from it as well. German intelligence reports, pieced together from the accounts of the few survivors, spoke of a terrifyingly fast and accurate artillery strike. It forced them to reconsider their own convoy tactics, leading them to move in smaller, more dispersed groups and to increase their anti-artillery reconnaissance. Frank Miller never intended to reshape military thinking. He was just trying to solve a problem and save his friends. But his one act of calculated defiance became a data point, a small but significant event that forced a giant institution to look in the mirror and question its own rules. It was a reminder that sometimes the most effective weapon on the battlefield isn't a piece of hardware, but the mind of a single, determined soldier. Could terror alone decide the fate of soldiers? The psychological impact on the German forces in the sector was as devastating as the physical destruction. For the soldiers who survived the valley, the experience was a scarring trauma. They had been part of a disciplined, confident military force on the advance. They had felt the thrill of the offensive, the belief that they were on the verge of a great victory. In the space of less than an hour, that confidence was shattered and replaced by a deep, gnawing fear. The survivors who straggled back to their own lines brought with them not just tales of destruction, but a palpable sense of terror. They spoke of an invisible enemy, a ghost gun that could strike anywhere with perfect accuracy. They described shells that seemed to anticipate their every move, that hunted them down with a malevolent intelligence. The rumors grew with each telling, transforming Frank Miller's single howitzer into a phantom battery of mythical proportions. This fear began to infect other units. The sight of the black smoke column, visible for miles, had already planted a seed of doubt. Now, the wild-eyed accounts of the survivors watered that seed. German truck drivers became hesitant to move on the narrow forest roads. Infantry squads marching to the front would nervously scan the skies and the silent, tree-lined ridges. The psychological blow was one of vulnerability. The Ardennes forest, which they had considered their ally, a cloak for their surprise attack, now felt like a trap. Every valley could be another killing jar. Every ridge could hide another ghost gun. This pervasive fear had a direct impact on German combat effectiveness. It undermined cohesion and discipline. Soldiers who are constantly looking over their shoulders are not focused on the enemy in front of them. Morale, the intangible glue that holds an army together, began to dissolve. The American forces, sensing this shift, capitalized on it. The story of the destroyed convoy was used as a propaganda tool, a story to bolster the confidence of their own troops and to further demoralize the enemy. The incident created a no-go zone in the German mind. The valley itself was completely avoided, forcing them to find longer, more difficult routes for their supplies, further snarling their already strained logistics. Terror, Miller had discovered, could be as effective a weapon as high explosives. He hadn't just destroyed machines and bodies, he had destroyed the enemy's will to fight. He had replaced their confidence with fear, their discipline with panic. And in a war that was as much a battle of nerves as it was of steel, that psychological victory was perhaps the most significant of all. Could bravery coexist with survival instinct? The burning barrage was a high-wire act performed without a net. While the outcome was a spectacular success, it came perilously close to disaster on multiple occasions. Each decision Frank Miller made was fraught with risk, not just to the mission, but to himself and his men. The most immediate danger was to his own gun crew. With each rapid-fire shot, the temperature inside the howitzer's breech climbed to dangerous levels. The standard procedure of swabbing the bore between rounds wasn't just for cleaning, it was to extinguish any lingering embers from the propellant bags that could prematurely ignite the next round. By skipping this step, Miller was gambling that no such ember remained. If he had lost that bet, the shell would have detonated while the breech was open, killing or maiming the entire crew. The crack that was later discovered in the breech was a silent testament to how close they came to that very fate. Then there was the risk of friendly fire. In the heat of the moment, with communication cut, Miller was relying on his own skill and the quick thinking of his gun crew. One miscalculation, one wrong number interpreted from his tracer round, and a 33-pound shell could have landed on the American infantry positions of Charlie Company, who were much closer to the convoy than regulations would normally permit for an artillery strike. The line between saving them and killing them was razor thin. And for Miller himself, the danger was personal and immediate. His decision to use tracer rounds from his exposed position was a desperate act of self-sacrifice. He intentionally drew the enemy's attention to himself. The volley from the German flak gun was not a near miss. It was a direct and accurate response. If he hadn't thrown himself behind the rock outcropping at the exact right second, he would have been killed instantly. His bravery was not a matter of ignoring fear. It was about functioning in spite of it. His survival instinct was screaming at him to stay hidden, to fall back, to save himself. But his sense of duty, his responsibility to the men counting on him, was stronger. He had to balance the instinct to preserve his own life with the courage required to win the battle. This constant nerve-shredding tension between risk and reward, between bravery and survival, is the true nature of combat. Success is often measured in inches and seconds. Frank Miller's victory was not a clean, heroic charge. It was a messy, dangerous, and desperate gamble where the line between a medal and a body bag was almost invisibly thin. Could you believe in miracles on the battlefield? For the men of the 109th Field Artillery Battalion, Sergeant Frank Miller became a living legend overnight. The men in his own gun crew, once they had a chance to sleep and process what they had done, spoke about the event with a kind of religious awe. They described the relentless pace, the glowing gun barrel, and the calm, unwavering voice of Miller on the radio, guiding them through the storm. They didn't fully understand the ballistics or the strategy, but they understood the result. They had been part of something extraordinary. It was like he could see the shell in the air and tell it where to land, Tony Gallo would recount later, sitting in a makeshift mess tent. Every time he gave a command, a few seconds later, we'd hear the boom from the valley, a big boom. He didn't miss, not once. The story was retold and embellished as it spread from battery to battery. The single howitzer became a magic gun. Miller's calculations became visions. His use of the tracer round was described not as a desperate improvisation, but as a stroke of pure, unadulterated genius. The men needed a hero. In the grim, bloody slog of the Battle of the Bulge, where victories were scarce and losses were heavy, the story of Miller's Valley was a beacon of light. It was a tale of David versus Goliath, of one American soldier with his wits and his courage standing against an entire enemy column and winning. His comrades looked at him differently. There was a new level of respect, a deference usually reserved for officers. They saw him not just as a skilled NCO, but as someone who possessed an almost supernatural talent for war. Miller himself was uncomfortable with the hero worship. "I just did the math," he would say, trying to deflect the praise. But his protests were useless. In the mythology of the unit, he was the man who had worked a miracle. To the soldiers on the ground who lived in a world of random chance and sudden death, the idea that skill and audacity could so decisively shape their fate was a powerful, comforting thought. It suggested that the chaos of war could, for a moment, be tamed. It made them believe that they too, when their moment came, might be capable of the extraordinary. They didn't need to understand the physics, they just needed to believe in the miracle. And Frank Miller, whether he liked it or not, had become theirs. Could one audacious act become a lesson for generations? The actions of Sergeant Frank Miller on that cold December morning did not happen in a vacuum. They belong to a long, unwritten history of battlefield innovation where soldiers under pressure have defied convention to achieve victory. This is the history of the forbidden trick. Throughout military history, regulations have always been written in the calm of headquarters while battles are fought in the chaos of the field. The rules are designed to create predictability and minimize risk. But war is inherently unpredictable, and sometimes the greatest risk is to do nothing. Miller's burning barrage echoes tactics seen in other eras. One can look back to the Napoleonic Wars, where artillery commanders would sometimes fire by ricochet, intentionally bouncing cannonballs off the hard ground to scythe through enemy infantry formations, a technique that was effective but unpredictable and often frowned upon. Or consider the lone fighter pilot in World War I who, out of ammunition, would dive at an enemy aircraft, using his own plane as a psychological weapon to force the opponent to break off. These are not tactics you find in a manual. They are born of desperation, insight, and a willingness to accept consequences. The core lesson of Miller's action is the eternal conflict between doctrine and initiative. Doctrine provides the foundation, the common language and procedures that allow large armies to function. But initiative is the spark that wins battles. Miller's genius was not just in knowing the forbidden trick, but in knowing precisely when to use it. He understood that the specific circumstances, the perfect terrain, the vulnerable target, the element of surprise, created a unique window where the potential reward massively outweighed the risk. His story became an informal lesson passed down from one generation of NCOs to the next. It's the story used to teach young leaders that their job is not just to follow orders, but to understand the intent behind the orders. The intent was to stop the German advance. Miller chose the most effective, albeit unauthorized, method to achieve that intent. In the sanitized world of military academies, his actions might be presented as a case study in operational risk assessment. But for the soldiers who heard the story, the lesson was simpler and more powerful. The rules will keep you safe. Your brain will help you win. And sometimes you have to be willing to break the first to achieve the second. It's a dangerous lesson, but it's one that has shaped the outcome of battles for centuries. Could courage, skill, and creativity leave a mark long after the smoke clears? Frank Miller finished his war not in a blaze of glory, but with the quiet competence that had always defined him. He served through the end of the Battle of the Bulge and the final push into Germany. He received his Distinguished Service Cross in a simple ceremony, shaking a general's hand while feeling profoundly awkward in a clean uniform. The official reprimand for destroying his howitzer remained in his file, a permanent ironic counterpoint to his medal. After the war, he went home to Ohio. He married his high school sweetheart, bought a small farm, and raised 2 children. He rarely spoke of the war and never of the valley. To his neighbors, he was just Frank Miller, a quiet, hard-working farmer who was good with numbers and could fix any engine. There were no statues raised in his honor. No books were written about his forbidden trick. His legacy was not one of public fame, but of quiet, personal impact. It lived on in the men whose lives he saved, men who went home to start families of their own because of what he did on that frozen ridge. It lived on in the unofficial lore of the 109th Field Artillery, a story told over beers at VFW halls, a testament to the idea that one NCO could make a difference. And it lived on as a lesson in the institutional memory of the U.S. Army, a small data point in an endless study of warfare, a reminder of the delicate balance between discipline and innovation. The moral of Frank Miller's story is not that rules are made to be broken. It is that rules are a framework, not a cage. It's a story about the unique power of the human element in the midst of mechanized warfare. It is about the courage to take responsibility, the skill to see an opportunity others miss, and the creativity to invent a solution when none exists. Long after the smoke cleared from the valley and the rusted hulks of the German convoy were reclaimed by the forest, the mark Frank Miller left was not on the landscape, but on the lives he touched and the history he quietly shaped. He proved that sometimes the most powerful force on the battlefield is a single, determined mind, willing to do the math, take the risk, and change the world, one shell at a time.